Welcome Life Science learners to another installment. Trust that you guys are well and excited about our lesson today. In our lesson today, we're going to be focusing on the ecological pyramids. We're going to look at trophic levels and how energy flows through an ecosystem. That's an important part of understanding how life forms exist. Energy needs to be transferred from one level to the next. So it's important that we understand how energy flows. We will look at mechanisms that explain energy flow, such as food chains and food webs. We'll try to get an understanding of what the different trophic levels are and what does it mean to be at a specific trophic level. And finally, we're going to look at how these are represented in terms of ecological pyramids. So trust that you guys are going to enjoy the lesson. Let's stay focused. Let's start off the lesson with looking at some basic terminology that's important to the rest of the lesson. So in our lesson, we're going to review terminology. We're going to spend some time looking at how energy flows in an ecosystem, and we're going to wrap this segment up with looking at some food chains and food webs in a bit. As I mentioned, it's important that you have the terminology and that you review your terminology at the start of every chapter. Make a list of these terms, guys. Write them down on a separate sheet of paper at the start of every section. It's good to use this as a reference check. It gives you an overview of the section. It does help you to consolidate your understanding once you're finished. So let's look at these terms. So we've mentioned the term ecology in the past, but it's important that we review that. Ecology is the study of the relationship between plants and animals with each other and the non-living environment in which they live. And it's important in us understanding the fact that organisms interact with each other and their environment. And that understanding we refer to as ecology. Ecosystems is the next term, a specific area or system in which the abiotic and the biotic components are interdependent and interact closely. So obviously when we look at ecosystems, these are areas where you find organisms, which are the biotic factors, interacting with the non-living organisms and how they are interdependent on each other. And we notice that ecosystems vary depending on the interactions that exist between the biotic and the abiotic factors. Further to this is the concept of a food chain, which we will unpack in a little while. But food chains show the order in which food is passed from one organism to another. So essentially, when we see organisms feeding on each other or the energy being transferred from one level to the next, we would say that that can be represented in a series of events, or in this case, using a chain of representation. So we represent the transfer of energy from one organism to the next using food chains. Another concept that we need to unpack is energy flow. And guys, it's important that we understand that energy flows through an ecosystem from the producers all the way up to the tertiary consumers. And so being able to understand what energy flow is an important part in understanding how organisms exist in their environment. So the energy flow refers to the flow of energy through a food chain. The next concept would be food webs, and a web is quite an intricate pattern. So when spiders spin together their webs are often very networked with having various different branches to them. So when we look at food webs, the concept around a food web is to be able to see how there are interconnected factors such as food chains between different species or organisms in an ecosystem. So a food web is a diagram that shows how several food chains are linked together in a more complex feeding relationships. So food chains show the unilateral movement from one to the next. A food web shows you the interconnectedness of the complex feeding relationships that exist in an ecosystem. Trophic levels will be the next concept that we look at, and these refer to the level an organism is positioned in a food chain. So we often refer to the first trophic level, second trophic level. So this refers to the level in which an organism is placed. We're going to spend some time looking at ecological pyramids, and a pyramid basically shows the relative numbers of plants or animals on the different trophic levels of an ecosystem. So we have different types of pyramids that illustrate the flow of energy, and that's what we're going to look at in a bit. And then the concept of bioaccumulation would be how there's an increase of substances such as pollutants in an organism through a food chain. And then the concept of biomagnification would be when there's an increase in the concentration of a substance at a certain trophic level in a food chain. In all food chains, it's important for us to be able to follow a pattern. And it often starts with food chains having autotrophs right at the bottom. An autotroph is essentially an organism that is capable of producing its own food. And plants do that by being able to photosynthesize. So the concept of an autotroph would be an individual or an organism using solar energy, which is then converted into chemical energy or carbohydrates by a process that we refer to as photosynthesis. So it's important that we understand that all food chains have to begin with autotrophs, which are the primary producers in a food chain. The next concept is, obviously, we base this on plants being our predominant organisms that photosynthesize and produce. As we move through a food chain, we see that they are primary consumers. And the word consume refers to users. So some of the food produced by the plants are eaten by primary consumers, and often these are known as herbivores. And your herbivores are those organisms that feed off plants. Okay? So the energy from the food is converted to heat or is used to grow, reproduce, etc. The energy is also lost, and this occurs through undigested food being released by the body or lost during respiration or as waste products. So you'll find that energy does move from one level to the next, in this case from the autotrophs to the primary consumers. The next level in a food chain would be your secondary consumers. The secondary consumers would be your carnivores and your omnivores, and these are those individuals that consume the primary consumers. Namely, they eat these herbivores, and they use the energy obtained from them to grow, move, respire, and carry out basic metabolism. So here you can see these are examples of your secondary consumers that are feeding off other primary consumers. And finally, we get to our tertiary consumers, and these are right at the top, and these are individuals that feed off other carnivores. So these are carnivores that could eat other carnivores, and if you look at the illustrations here, we've got an eagle feeding off fish, and we've got an apex predator here, a lion, which is seen as a tertiary consumer, and these feed off other predators and other herbivores. So then you'll find that the amount of energy that they get obviously is passed on from the previous trophic level. And before we wrap this segment up, we've got to mention the context of decomposers being an important part of energy flowing through an ecosystem. And so we refer to these as your decomposers. And your decomposers, examples of which I've illustrated here, are some fungi and bacteria. And these are individuals that play an important role in breaking down the waste products and returning these nutrients back into the food chain. And that is part of completing the nutrient cycle in any ecosystem. The concept of trophic levels, as I mentioned, each organism belongs to a specific trophic level, which is referred to the position that an organism occupies in a food chain. And we mentioned the concept that energy flows, and that movement of energy flow is energy moving through from one trophic level to the next in a food chain. It's important that we understand the concept of energy flow when we look at how an organism survives in a food chain. Energy, again, is transferred from autotrophs all the way to your tertiary consumers at different levels. Guys, we've looked at the basic concepts around energy flow. In our next part of the lesson, we're going to look at how energy flows through an ecosystem, and we're going to spend some time looking at the different trophic levels. So you've been a fantastic audience. Have a quick stretch break, and I'll see you in a bit.